This edition of Charcha with Srimati Indu Viswanathan by Agastya Gurukulam. The title for today's Charcha is Hindu-American Encounters with Schools. I'll give you a brief introduction to our guest today. Indu Viswanathan has worked in the field of education for 20 years as a teacher, as an educator of teachers, and as a nonprofit research director. She is currently a doctoral candidate at Columbia University in their Teachers College. Her research focuses on the transnational consciousness of second-generation Indian American teachers. She is a second-generation Hindu-American herself, raising third-generation Hindu American children. In addition to having experienced how Hinduism is taught in American schools, both as a student and as a teacher herself, she has seen how it impacts her children and where it sits in conversations about school, immigration, and teacher education. She's keenly aware that the academic narrative about Hinduism is controlled by a small group of influencers who both reinscribe coloniality and do not seem open to scholarly liberal dissent. She is committed to adding Dharmic voices and reverence for adhikara to the conversation. So with that, let me welcome Induji to our Chai Pe Charcha and Induji.
Namaskaram. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very excited to chat with you. We've been talking for a few weeks now, and I'm really looking forward to this.
So we have actually had a very large list of questions submitted by our participants. Yeah. And I don't see how we are going to get through all of them in an hour, but I'm going to get started right away so that we can get through as many of them as possible.
Sounds good.
You know, you started off in a totally different field, but then switched to education. So how did that happen, and what drew you to education, and what has been your journey in education since then?
I started off as an economist. I got a bachelor's degree in economics because, well, I'll backtrack a little bit. My father is an engineer, and he came here in 1966, you know, a very classic post-1965 immigration law change immigrant from India. He suggested that I become an engineer, and after we had a good laugh about it, I decided to pursue other things, and I went to a liberal arts college, and I studied different things. I started off as a math major, then a government major, and then I settled on economics as a sort of happy medium between the two. Worked as an economist for a few years because, you know, my father's advice was pursue what you're passionate about, but it should also be practical. You should be able to make a living off of it. And so, you know, stick to something that gives you concrete tools. So economist seemed to make sense. And while I was intellectually intrigued by the field of economics, I was not, neither was I personally satisfied with the sort of work culture, nor was I really compelled by the impact I was having on society. And I had grown up in a household that was not only deeply steeped in love and reverence, and very specific, not in dogma, but in love and reverence for dharma and for the sort of spirit of inquiry that I think is baked into our civilization. But also a really keen sense of, you know, what are we doing in our time and during our time on this planet? That was very much a question that my parents guided me in. And so that question kept coming back to me. And so I happened to be volunteering on the weekends while I was working as an economist with an organization that was just mentoring inner city youth, not just academically, but just sort of engaging with them. And I started thinking to myself, you know, I'm 22 years old and I enjoy waking up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning to go work with these kids more than I enjoy going to my paid gig. There's something there. And so my boss, who who was the chief US economist of this investment bank, was very much like a big brother and a mentor for me. And he had come from a family of teachers. And upon reflection, I actually had teachers in my family in India, and it hadn't even occurred to me that that was sort of a viable profession. And so as I sat with it and thought about my options and how I wanted to be engaging in the world and what I wanted to be doing as a human being on the planet, what I would be proud to tell my children I did every day, one day when I had children. Education and working with kids and working with people in real environments and being in that spirit of inquiry just made so much sense.
So going back to the growing up here in the US, what was your experience specifically growing up as a Hindu kid here? Did you come across Hinduphobia in those times?
I would say, so this was, I'm dating myself now, we're talking about the 70s and 80s. And so then it was either that nobody really knew about it. I mean, I guess in some new age places, not where I grew up, but maybe like new agey, West Coasty stuff, maybe there was some concept of yoga and spirituality, but not necessarily linked with Hinduism. But other than that, people were pretty clueless, except for really like grossly racist, like horrifyingly overt things that any reasonable and kind person would say, well, that doesn't seem very nice. And so in ways, yes, it existed. You had things like Indiana Jones coming out. You had, all of these overtly exotifying tropes coming out. And at the same time, it wasn't as insidious. It was so overt that it was easy to point out. So yes, I certainly grew up with the most obvious aspects of Hinduism being mocked, but also because I grew up in a community that was, I grew up with a lot of Jewish people. And so there wasn't this sort of Christian normativity in the community that I grew up with. And there was an awareness that there is a dominant religion in the country and that other people are impacted by it. So having grown up in New York, I think, with our New York values, it sort of sheltered me from some of that, or it allowed me to talk about some of it, but certainly it was around. And then as I got older, and I expressly didn't study Hinduism in college because for me, it had always been very private. So because it was sort of overtly mocked and misunderstood in public spaces and in media and in school, I adopted a very private version of Hindu. I wasn't sort of publicly Hindu. I was privately Hindu, and it guided all of my choices, but it's not something I really talked about. And so when I went to college, it didn't seem like something that I would engage with academically. And so now we're talking about the early 90s. And I think that's when some of this very deep rooted Hinduphobia in academia started to take hold in a different way. So instead of it being these bad anthropologists mocking Hinduism, it became Hinduism itself needs to be deconstructed and dismantled, and it's bad. And so while I wasn't privy to that because I didn't study it, I soon became aware of it when I went out into the world after graduation. So it's changed form, I guess is my short answer.
Right. And so now do you think your children are having to deal with more Hinduphobia than you did, and shaming because of being Hindus? Are you seeing that?
So, I talked to them about it, and they say that it doesn't really come up in school, and that their identities don't come up in school. But also their identities don't come up in school. And so they're very aware that there are these ideas being circulated in the media, popular ideas that seem to have some kind of cachet amongst people who want to do the right thing. People who identify as critical thinkers, as progressive, and as a family, we very much do. And of course, we're operating with a completely different set of assumptions and information. Right. So it's not that we're against critical thinking or progressive thinking. We're just operating with a different set of assumptions.
Right.
And so I think they're tentative, even with me as their mother, I think they're tentative with engaging in these conversations because there is so much narrative to unpack, and they're kids and they just kind of want to be kids. And so because the situation allows them to avoid it because they're not having to deal with stuff, they just kind of avoid it, which I kind of get. I mean, when you're a multiply minoritized teenager, you kind of just want to fit in.
Right. how about yourself as a Hindu teacher in the public school system? Have you encountered Hinduphobia or racism, and how have you dealt with it?
I think it's helpful to first maybe unpack the term Hinduphobia a little bit, because I think it's a little bit misleading. So I would say the things that I would ascribe to Hinduphobia are the very overt, like you eat monkey brains type of like fear mongering about what Hindus actually do and that our practices are sort of disgusting or repellent, those sorts of stereotypes. But what I see around me happening that I'm becoming increasingly, I guess, articulate in naming, is that it's couched under humanitarian work. That in order to be a good person, you need to call out all of the ways in which Hinduism is bad, and not in just Hindu society, but theologically is grounded in these oppressive things. And so that becomes like a really difficult thing to combat, right? Especially when you're in an environment, you know, like I got my teaching degree in a program that's committed to teaching from a social justice stance. And so that becomes really complicated. It also becomes a place where I can have these conversations. They're difficult, but I can have these conversations. I just need to get better at naming it and talking about it. So the ways in which I would say that I encounter it is that, you know, for instance, when I decided to write my dissertation and focus on Indian American teachers, the first question I got from any professor or any peer really that knew a little bit about Indian society was, well, are you going to take up caste? So in that sense, I would say the reduction of all of Hindu society and all of India to caste, and I'm not at all saying that caste is not an issue, but the reduction of the entire conversation to caste is a form of Hinduphobia maybe, or Hindu-misia or anti-Hinduism. It is a colonial lens on caste. And when I say that, I'm not even saying that caste is simply a byproduct of coloniality or colonialism. I acknowledge that there are things built into Hindu society that have lasted past the end of colonialism that we need to address. But ascribing that to the theology of Hinduism and to the scriptural foundation, to the Shruti of Hinduism rather than the Smriti, is a real problem that needs to be addressed.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the colonial lens seems to filter out a whole spectrum, a whole array of positive things about Hinduism, and focusing only on these few negatives. So certainly that's a problem. As we go along, I'm going to try to credit our participants with the questions they asked. This question that I just asked you was submitted by Smita ji. So Hindu kids are taught, you know, one set of beliefs at home, and at school they learn a whole different set of beliefs and values. How do young children make sense of this dichotomy? How does it affect biology, you know?
Sure. I think, you know, in my work with, just broadly with immigrant children identities, you see this across, you know, not just with Hindu children, but with any children that are going to school in a country where their parents didn't go to school. Like that's kind of how I'm identifying, you know, this sort of immigration status. I think it's very natural to develop sort of dual identities because you're just operating in two different environments, two different, you know, to use the popular term, ecosystems that are premised on very different things. And in the case, I think of Hindu children growing up in Hindu homes, it's almost like you're existing in two different civilizational paradigms. So it's not simply culture. I think culture reduces it to these sort of superficial performances, or reduces it to like constructs of maybe values or morals that are still don't question the civilizational home of all of those things. So I've started to think about it more as this civilizational conflict. And when we're living in Western civilization, but we're not naming it as Western civilization, it becomes universalized as the norm, and then home becomes odd, and you develop these these strange dichotomies. And so you put on these different masks. And a huge part of my, I would say, growth as a human being was to, you know, up until I went to college, I could sort of have this dichotomous persona because home was a different place than school. When I got to college, I was living at school. And so, you know, it couldn't just be reduced to my room in my apartment that I was sharing with non-Hindus, right? Like I had to sort of confront this dichotomy. And so I would say college definitely became a place where I had to sort of resolve some of these things and really come into my own. And I happened to go to a college where there was a huge Indian population, and there were sort of these Indian clubs, or not fraternities, but Indian clubs or social societies. And I saw that they were very much premised on these at a very cultural level. And my experience, having grown up as one of, you know, not even a handful of Hindus in a very white community, I wasn't used to that, sort of associating with people simply on the basis of culture. And so that, like, I almost retreated more. I don't know. It was an interesting shift, but I would say very much, I was aware as a child that my parents didn't know what it was like to grow up surrounded by people who were not like you. Yeah. And I was aware of the fact that they didn't know that how harmful that could feel, how isolating that could feel, how that could make you feel like an artifact, a social study, like a museum artifact in school. And I was aware that knowing that might hurt them. And even as a young child, I wanted to protect my parents from that, and protect my parents from the realities of my experiences at school, because I knew, and I had such deep respect for everything that they had done in order to provide me with these opportunities. So it was almost like out of reverence and respect for everything that my parents had done and continued to do and continue to do, I wanted to protect them and keep them safe from the reality that was around me.
That's really, amazing and interesting to think that a child that young could be trying to protect the parents rather than the other way around. We always think as parents that, we have to protect our children, but I don't know if, how many parents on this call who are watching us realize that actually maybe our children are trying to protect us by hiding, what they really feel about the situation. So.
Yeah, I think it's hiding. I think it's filtering. I think it's a lot of translating. You see this, interestingly, you don't see it as much in Indian American families because, Indian parents are often fluent in English because of colonization. But when you, for instance, you see in other communities, East Asian diaspora communities and Latin American, where the parents are not necessarily fluent in English, and the children act as translators. And that's not simply linguistic. That's at a paradigm level, that's at a cultural, they're translating this new environment for their parents in the act of translating, the language for them. And while it might appear that Indian parents don't need that, immigrant parents don't need that translation, there is a lot of translating and communicating and whatever it is that children here are doing for their parents when their parents didn't grow up here.
Something for many of us, I think, to chew on. So what can we as parents do to help our kids navigate this cultural chasm that exists, How can we make sure that on one side they achieve success in this world, in this Western world, outside world, and at the same time value their roots and stay true to it?
Sure. I think it's important to have really open conversations about how we're even defining what success is. And I think that certainly changes across generations. And as the sort of zeitgeist changes, we've seen a huge shift in the zeitgeist, even in the past few months. And I think not determining what that ought to feel like or what that experience ought to be for our children, but being receptive to what it actually is for them and having open conversations about it. That's not to say that I'm not of the persuasion that parents simply should be friends to their children. I think that's irresponsible. I think that's putting too much pressure on our children. We're still their guides. We're still teaching them how to navigate the world, and we have a responsibility to do that. I think we need to be open to the fact, or to the reality that our commitment might be to teach them to navigate their world, not the world that we want for them. And so how do we do that? We do that by really deeply listening to what their reality is and what's happening for them. And I think, going back to the point I made earlier, acknowledging and recognizing that they may be protecting us from things and letting them know that they can tell us things that they think might be hard for us to hear, and we may not fully understand it, but we're open to listening and learning from them.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's a lot of dialogue. I think it's being savvy to what the reality is here and not simply being satisfied with rejecting it as not aligned with our values. I don't think that serves anyone.
I have Shivani Ji, who said, I'm just going to read out, maybe 4 or 5 questions, and then you can address them together. Shivani Ji, who said, how do we make kids listen to their parents, which is a, fundamental value in our culture and civilization. Aditi Ji from New York asks, how do we teach them our values? Deepti Ji from San Ramon asks, how much religion can you push onto your child? And Chandragi asks, how do we enforce Hindu identity on children living in the USA?
Okay, so the answer to the last 2 questions is you can't. And if there is any sort of powerful message about Sanatana Dharma that I would want to share with the world, is how beautifully it embraces the seeker and the spirit of inquiry and longing for something more. And you can't impose longing on anybody. And the more you try to do it, the more it will be rejected. So that's 1. 2, I would say, for me, what I know about my own children, what I've seen in my experience of teaching, is that children are paying attention to what you do and not what you say. So the best way to pass along the values is to embody them, to talk about how the journey of embodying them. So another quality I would say that I really appreciate about Sanatana Dharma, like philosophically, but also in terms of how it's communicated, is that it is not preachy, and it's not about righteousness. It's about finding the right path in the difficult and confusing existence that is being a human being in the world. And so I think navigating it not from a sense of moral authority, but moral dilemma, and openly talking about that at an age-appropriate level with your children, so that you're recognizing that, and again, another contribution I think that we make to the world is that life is not black and white. We don't live in these binaries where there's an obvious choice. I mean, that's a premise of so much of what we talk about, right? And so navigating that and talking about that openly, as opposed to this is the right way, this is simply the conclusion one must draw, as opposed to this is the difficult journey I took in arriving at this conclusion, I think is incredibly compelling because it's incredibly relatable. So the more relatable we can make ourselves to our children while still thinking about the fact that they're watching us and they're watching our decisions, they're watching the way we're talking about different people and different things all the time. And so, and that doesn't mean we have to be perfect, but I think that means that we have to act with that awareness, and be humble in how we're taking this up, and that it is a path. It's not a conclusion.
And there are a few other questions that sort of progress to a child who's, into the teenage. And so Tarunji asks, how do we pass on Hindu culture to the 2nd and 3rd generation? So he's going forward. And then how do we continue to instill Hindu culture once the child turns a teen? How do we get the next generation involved and interested in Hinduism? This is from Leena Ji from Princeton. And then a couple others who say, my child tells me she's unable to connect to our mythology and our gods through that. This is from Punitaji. And similar observation from Balakrishnaji from Abu Dhabi, saying, when I teach my kid our Dharma Shastras, my kids asks me several questions because they conflict with what they're taught in schools. So I think you addressed that partly in saying, you have to acknowledge the moral dilemma and talk about it, be open to talking about it. Is there anything else that you would?
Yeah, absolutely. I had this moment click for me recently where, we know that our all of the scriptures and everything that we have available to us, that it's beyond theology, that it's sort of a not just a civilizational blueprint, but ancient, but also contemporary at the same time. It's timeless. Something we can lean on to understand how to navigate the world. And yet we continue to talk about it as tradition in a paradigm, in a Western civilizational paradigm that places tradition in the past as something that's that does not have contemporary purchase. And so I think it would help us to start thinking about what is the contemporary Dharmic expression? What is the contemporary application of Dharma around us in our lived experiences in the world? And we can look to these examples that are, that emerge from our lineages, from our past, and understand that they are timeless, and how are they timeless, and how can we apply them, and how might we chew on something that's happening in the world around us, using this as a lens, as a tool, as opposed to that's wrong, or with sort of these platitudes about ahimsa, for instance, because that doesn't really get at the dilemma. That's just sort of a Band-Aid. I think we have to be real about how complicated these things are. The other thing I'll say is, and this ties back to my journey towards getting involved in education and more broadly in the humanities, is that in responding and reacting to the fact that in India, the disciplines of the humanities have been taken over by distinctly anti-Hindu forces, we've sort of convinced ourselves as a community that that's an unsafe place for us. Let's stick with STEM and other sort of technical professions. And ironically, the civilization that has survived and is so vibrant and is enlivened by the arts and humanities and storytelling and all of these things, we've sort of like ceded that to, quote, the other side. We need to take that back, right? I mean, that's how you enliven it. You enliven it with, I saw someone post recently how everyone in lockdown is watching the Ramayana and Mahabharatam from the 80s, and how even then the special effects were very sweet, but certainly not up to par. But the story holds, right? Even now, these are interesting stories to watch. We are brilliant storytellers. If you took the special effects, and this is the point of this person's Facebook post, if you took the special effects out of Lord of the Rings, or if you took the special effects out of the Avengers, would those stories even really hold? So much of it is based on sort of the technical world, that's the magical world that's created by, but the story doesn't actually really, there's not much to it. Right. It would be like a 30-minute episode maybe of something. So there's so much beautiful storytelling and narrative. There's so much that's there. And yet we're telling our children, don't go into the humanities. Don't become writers. Don't go into those spaces because they're dangerous for us, as opposed to, we're going to equip you to actually do this really well and take it back for us. We need to take the humanities back for us. I think that's what we need to equip and enliven our children to do, and not force children to do that. Everyone has their own path or journey. But I think this idea that everybody needs to stay away from the humanities because they're dangerous is feeding that monster. And I think we need to actually go in and Trojan horse it.
Several parents have asked if there are resources that you'd recommend. So, easy to read books or videos you'd recommend for kids. And then, where do we start and how do we start teaching them about Indian culture?
That's a really good question. I know that you can have materials out there, but content does not equal learning, and having access to content does not equal teaching, and content knowledge does not equal pedagogical content knowledge. And so it's important to, I think there are some, Balavihar produces beautiful books, for instance, but to the point, that the person made earlier, if your child is not able to connect to the materials, it doesn't really do a lot of good. So I think it's important to have our children in communities with their peers, with older kids, connecting with these materials. So I know, for instance, that Hindu Students Council has recently started like a study group or like a book club around the Mahabharata. And so it's a college student who's sort of leading these conversations, these dialogues, as high school students are reading the Mahabharata. So I would say the resources are actually the communities engaging with all of this. And I think we need to do a lot more of that, because we are not a sort of text download civilization. We are dialogical. Even our texts are written in dialogue form. They're always in conversation. Everything is about relating, and we emerged from an oral tradition, not even a written one. That was really important to us. So how do we embrace that in the 21st century? What is the 21st century sort of experience and enlivenment of that? That's the word I keep going back to. How do we enliven this in the 21st century, right? So I think there's a difference between a guru sitting in front of his or her shishya in a space, giving a talk, because something is happening at an energetic level, something is happening at a pranic level, something is happening at another level when we're in the same space. That's really different than sitting on a webinar where someone is giving a talk, right? You can't simply just take certain aspects of a practice that emerged from a particular context that is very much emerged and emerges from our knowledge of quantum physics, whatever you want to call it, and then just sort of like transplant bits and pieces of that to like Zoom and think that that's going to work. We're not a people who just sits and reads a text and then sort of like through osmosis, it becomes our reality. We ask questions. We're supposed to be troubled by things. We're supposed to embrace that. When I was growing up, my parents did not hesitate to say, I don't know, let's find out, let's ask somebody. And that stuck with me, that model they gave me of like, I don't know. And that they were not afraid of not knowing. And they actually embraced it. That stuck with me, has stuck with me my entire life. So that's a really long and probably unsatisfying answer to that question, but I'm okay with that.
That's okay. That gave us a very useful thing to remember, the very important sentence of I don't know. To be honest with your children about that, I think is really important.
Yeah.
So I agree with that. Now, you mentioned the Hindu Students Council, and I'm just going to take this opportunity to say a little bit about them because I noticed people asking some questions about that book club. So the Hindu Students Council is a pan-Hindu youth organization. It serves, I believe initially it was primarily for college students, young professionals who had graduated from college, but then they have expanded to high schools as well. So now they actually have chapters of Hindu Students Council for high schools, as well as several universities to have them too. So the idea is that they create a community of, for, and by young Hindu Americans, where they can learn about Sanatana Dharma, share their experiences and questions openly, and explore their Hindu identity. They have over 40 chapters, I understand, which, of course, given the number of universities and schools in the US is not very large, so there's certainly scope for expansion. But their activities, a lot of their activities are virtual, including their discussion groups and book clubs. They also do a lot of seva, opportunities come up. They create advocacy materials, etc. And all of this is run by the young Hindus. So their website is www.hindustudentscouncil. It's one word, hindustudentscouncil.org. So those who are interested can look them up and get your child connected if you're interested.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Absolutely. the promise, I think, of them engaging with high school students, and I think eventually middle school students, is the time is ripe for it. It's sort of just expanding naturally, and I think it comes from a very honest assessment that oftentimes college is too late to do this, and that kids are looking for this earlier and can benefit from it earlier, and that because middle school and high school is, in terms of child development, a huge part of identity development, by the time they get to college, that's already kind of formed, that having these groups and more large, and in a broader sense in schools, you would call these like affinity groups. Having an affinity group for Hindu American kids in middle school and high school is an incredibly promising step, I think, for our community to take.
A couple other questions. So Raviji from Corvallis was asking, how do we build confidence in children to be Hindu in the public space? And again, how do we counter this mainstream narrative and tackle negative stereotypes about Hinduism? This is from Rachita ji from Randolph and Saurabh ji from Garnet Valley. They were similar questions.
I would say a number of things. Again, have these conversations, and being courageous doesn't mean not having fear. So I think acknowledging that it can be scary and overwhelming with our children, and not simply don't be scared. I think that's really helpful. I think also having opportunities for our children to see Hindus engaged in society here, in other fields maybe that their parents are not in, to see that we are like living, breathing, contributing members of the society at large. We are creating this society. So it's not as isolated. We're not as isolated and as lone as we think. So back again to that idea of community, connecting them with other kids. There are some incredible Hindu American teenagers that just, they're so articulate, they're so grounded. So I think there are a lot of incredible role models, even in their peer group. And so getting them all connected with each other, I think is really powerful. Yeah, I think all of those things. And then just getting more of us engaged in our authentic expressions of Dharma across careers, across society, across fields, and less in pockets. I think it's isolation and not being integrated that actually creates a lot of fear.
Yeah. So here's a question from Srikanji from Richmond. Is it advisable to send my kids to regular US school along with a Gurukulam education? And I have a sort of diametrically opposite question from Ajay ji from Melbourne. What is your view of Hindus sending their kids to Catholic or missionary schools?
I think you can send your kid to any school depending on, anything is teachable. So you can always talk about what's happening in school, and then you have to acknowledge what is the day-to-day lived experience for your child going to that school, what is normed. I sent my kids to public school for elementary school. They're in private school now for a few reasons. I would say there is no one solution. The country is vast. Schools look really different, and you engage with it differently. So I would find out what's going on in your kid's school, be engaged in it, join the PTA or school board, whatever it is. Let's be more engaged in these and understand these institutional environments, not simply as consumers, but as people who are a part of building them. And then I think it becomes less scary, because then it's not like, oh, if I send them there into this vast unknown, well, it's not, don't make it a vast unknown. Make it known to yourself. Get engaged in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even getting engaged, for instance, as on the school council or whatever the local governing boards are for the schools, that itself will give us a voice to start with, until we wait for the next generation to actually enter the system. Especially in the United States, we're a high-tech culture. 90% of us are probably in high-tech fields. But it's very rare to find somebody who's in the humanities or in other things like, even teaching, like you've gone into. So what would you say about encouraging kids to take up teaching as a career, Hindu kids here?
I would say let's encourage our children to actually be connected to their actual dharma. And I would love to see more of us in education because, and it's the research on broadly Asian Americans in education and in the teaching profession is really interesting because it's sort of widely acknowledged that the Asian, and I'm lumping it all together, it isn't a monolith, but the Asian Americans who are here because of immigration laws are largely well educated and therefore value education. And I think it can be said of Indian civilization in general as one that values education, yet so few people go into the field of teaching. And I would say even in India, while teaching is respected as an honorable profession, it's certainly not an aspirational career, right? So what is this dichotomy? What is this thing that we're not actually valuing teaching as a profession? And so I think what ends up happening in all societies, but let's look at American culture, it ends up being a consumer product. We come here with our high-tech, high-paying, whatever jobs, and we want our children to consume these good educations. And then when we don't like the product, then we start questioning the product and sort of getting upset about the product. And I think we need to rethink that because education is not a business, it's not a consumer product. It is a place where, and we see this now everywhere with these controversies and these painful encounters that Hindus are having with curriculum in American schools. Schools are a site where society decides what is true and what knowledge is worthy of being passed on. So I think that if we want to sustain ourselves as a civilization, we need to engage in these sites. We need to engage thoughtfully in these sites and not simply dismiss them because they're not going away. Public education and schools are not going away. You can dismiss them and legitimately critique them as long as we want. But if we're critiquing them from the outside, like, okay, cool, it's not going away. Unless we want to be a society that lives completely like in these communes detached from everyone else, we actually need to engage and do this work. And I would say more broadly, I think it's important for us to not simply dismiss, for instance, humanities or qualitative research because we don't agree with the outcomes of that research on our culture, on Hinduism, on the history of Hinduism, but actually develop the skills to critique it internally and say, well, that's just bad qualitative research. That's really shoddy ethnography. It's not that I don't believe in, post-structuralism. It's not a matter of whether I believe in it. That's a really poor execution of that research. I think those are skills that we need to start building up. And I think that's a way to do this work in a way that's sustainable and that actually has teeth.
Very true, very true. I mean, I think the experience of Hindu American kids in school would probably be much better if we had more Hindu voices among the teaching community. So that's certainly something that would serve our community very well.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, my first year teaching, I had a Nepali student in my class who's Hindu, and she came up to me, and my first year teaching was the first year after 9/11. So it was a very particularly fraught time for brown people in New York, especially.
Yes.
And I had written something about, on the anniversary of 9/11, and she came up to me after I had shared, and with tears in her eyes, and I'll never I can imagine it now if I close my eyes. She said, "You'll never understand what it means for me that you're my teacher."
Oh, wow.
Like I have like tears in my eyes now, even thinking about it. And this was 18 years ago.
Yeah. Now, talking of Hindu kids in college, I'm going to, focus on that. So, there have been so many instances of second generation Hindu kids denouncing Hindu and Indian culture once they enter university. In fact, it's a growing trend now in some of the major universities to have students against Hindutva organizations. I know that a lot of Hindu parents, when I have mentioned this to them, have been shocked to hear that. I had never come across an organization that's against a culture or a religion. All the university groups, when I was a student, were for certain groups like Jewish or Muslim
Mm-hmm.
or others. But now we have this phenomenon of students against Hindutva. And unfortunately, a lot of them are, by our own second generation Hindus. So, all those years of Sunday school, be it Chinmaya Mission, Arya Samaj, the local Hindu temple or Gayatri Parivar, whatever Hindu organizations, they all seem to have had no effect on these kids. So why do you think this complete turnaround is happening? I mean, I understand not being able to connect with it, maybe, but to have this complete turnaround and to hate Hinduism, where have we failed as a community?
Okay, so first, let's give ourselves a little bit of a break. There are forces at play that are beyond the locus of control of parents, and parenting is really, really hard. And I can't even imagine what it's like to move to another country and raise your children. So let's give parents a little bit of a break and not call ourselves failures. But I would say, rather than these programs that we sent our children to didn't work, I think maybe a more generative question is, what is it that they were learning and what is it that they weren't learning that's creating a disconnect between being a practicing Hindu and being a good person in the world? And that's not to say, obviously, that I think that there is a disconnect between those things, but clearly that message is not coming across. That there's, because the reason that these kids are taking up, or these college students are taking up under these banners against, and I would say it's not against Hinduism as a religion, it's against a sort of politicized, a concept of what politicized Hinduism is, and the fact that Hinduism in practice, and maybe even theologically, is oppressive. Obviously that was not deconstructed for them. And they're also operating from, a set of information and a set of assumptions, and they're drawing this conclusion. So first, I would say it's not because they don't, it's not because we failed in imparting what we think, is at the core of Hinduism or whatever. It's because that the connection between practicing that and being a good person in the world was not made. And they're very much longing to be a good person in the world. And to some degree, there is probably some virtue signaling and performativity happening on college campuses, which is, age appropriate for college. That makes sense. People are testing and trying on different things. Unfortunately, this is what it looks like right now. So I think it's really important for us to dig beyond just saying that, it's the narrative, and understand, how do we, as a Hindu American community, take up the United States as our karma bhumi also, and live as Dharmic people here, not just in a cultural home sort of, or community, these are our values, these are our things, but how do we actually enliven them in the world around us? How do we, and Canadians, how do we sort of, unfortunately, I mean, I don't think it's just about performing this, but how do we actually live this out in the world around us, and not just sort of sustain it in our homes, I guess is sort of the driving point that I'm making. Because for me, I'm not engaged in anti-racist work despite the fact that I'm a Hindu. I'm doing it because it comes from my sense of Dharma. And I don't know that that connection is necessarily being made at home, right? My dad happened to arrive at the tail end of the civil rights movement in the United States and was very aware of it. I would say the bulk of people arriving, post 90s, the US looked really different. They're not aware of necessarily what that felt like. My dad could feel it, and I was raised with that awareness, right? And so I made those connections, and those connections were something we talked about as I was growing up, right? I think also, just as, and I feel like I could talk about this for the rest of my life, just as there is a tendency and there is a pattern of people taking up the paradigm of the United States of anti-racism and applying it onto India, I think the reversed conflation is also happening. And so when kids go to their parents and talk about these ideas, and their parents dismiss them as liberal, progressive, whatever, it's being read in a really different way because they're reading it through a US lens and the parents might be saying it through an Indian lens or an Indic lens. And so they might be using the same words, but the meanings are completely different. And so how do we effectively communicate with our children why we're thinking these things, why we're saying these things? You know, and I will say, up until a few years ago, it's not that I necessarily had the same feelings as these college kids, but I was really confused. I didn't understand Indian politics at all. I didn't understand what was happening in India. I was confused because my parents seemed to be supporting something that didn't align with what I knew they supported here. And so I would argue with my parents, but I'm still very respectful of my parents. And so because of that reverence and that knowledge that my parents had demonstrated my entire life, that they were really good people who stood up for the right thing and didn't just stand up for Hinduism. They were not identitarian in their practice of Hinduism. They always stood up for the right thing. So that made me question my own assumptions because I had reverence for my parents, right? And so then I started getting into conversations with my dad, and my dad is an amazing, like, critical media consumer. And so he was like, look at the ways in which the media is, and then I had my like, oh my gosh moment. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Yeah. And that's sort of like what led me. And this is me in, you know, my late 30s, early 40s that I'm having this revelation. And so I think all of the things we've been talking about so far, having seen my parents be role models of just living this in their practice in the world, and my reverence for my parents and my connection with all of this, gave me the space and gave me the humility to not assume that I knew it all and my parents knew nothing, because they were always willing to have conversations and say they didn't understand. So then I grew up with that idea that I may not understand, I may not know. And that's what allowed us to have those conversations. And that's what allowed me to almost like wake up to this.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting if we, polled maybe even the Hindu parents who are on this webinar to see how many of them have actually had a conversation with their kids about the whole, protest that erupted after George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, these are things that are happening all around us. And I think we Hindus have a tendency we're not really into local politics, that we probably don't speak very much about it. And so we just go on with our lives. And I think we're losing these crucial opportunities to explain to our children what Hinduism says about such things and what our position is on this as Hindus, which we don't realize because we think they're wearing the same lens as us because we don't know the American lens, but they're clearly wearing a different lens. And I've started noticing that in my own interactions with my daughter. So I think that's a really key thing, to keep talking to them about these things that they to their friends about.
Yeah. And I think keep talking and also keep being a learner. My dad is in his late 70s. He's been here for 54 years. And he still says, I still have so much to learn about this country. Like, there's no way I could call myself an expert. And yet I'll see sort of armchair scholars sitting in India talking to their like two friends who live in the US and have been here for 5 years. Suddenly they're experts on what's happening on the ground here. And, completely and they're very quick to criticize us living here for not understanding what's going on the ground in India, but they seem to have expertise and authority on what's going on here. So I think, let's check our hubris a little bit. Let's embrace some more humility. And I would say, let's embrace that authentic inquirer and that longing for knowing, that seeking stance that does come with that gift that is being a Hindu, is not already knowing.
So I have a question from Suket Ji from Bhopal, saying, what do you say about the rising Hinduphobia in USA and the fake history being promoted about Hinduism? So, even at the highest academic levels, such as the likes of Audrey Trushke and others who have a very pronounced anti-Hindu narrative. So what did you say about that?
I would say, I'm going to zoom out for a moment. I think it's really easy to feel really dejected and fearful and negative when we look at the reality that Hindus are facing in a distinctly, I would say, not just Hindu-phobic, but anti-Hinduism, right? So it's not just about Hindu people, it's about Hinduism world, I decided, and I keep having to retake this oath, that I'm going to focus 51% or more on what Hinduism is and what we're fighting for, and less of my attention on what we're fighting against. So that's just sort of like a foundational premise. What I would say about it is, okay, yeah, that's our reality. Like, we have to accept that that's our reality, not accept it from a sense of like Western acceptance, not resignation. But yeah, this is the reality we're living in. We have to do something about it. I think there are, if we really like dig into it, and this goes to my point from earlier, I think rather than pointing from the outside and saying, she's bad, and I was just telling a friend earlier, I wish we could just sort of erase this word sentiments from all Hindus' minds, because it is the poorest excuse to fight against this. This is not about hurt feelings. These are like sort of, in terms of scholarship, it's really bad scholarship. So let's have more Hindu historians naming all the ways in which Audrey and all of these other people are just conducting really poor research. Let's, and you see brilliant minds like Vishwa Adluri and Jaydeep Bakshi doing this work in the academy. So let's support scholars who are doing that from within the academy. But the solution, I would say, is not to say, let's mount a sort of public media attack against this person, let's file a lawsuit against, because that's sort of a self goal for Hindus. That makes us look like we're trying to censor liberal studies or liberal or a place for dissent. And let's say, no, actually, you guys are not allowing dissent. We need more voices in this conversation. Why are you not allowing more voices in this conversation? Let's add voices to the conversation. We're not afraid of debate, and we have all our receipts. Like, we can do really good research. We can show up with receipts. We can show up with proof. What proof do you have? And let's take it down from the inside. So I would say, like, yeah, it's overwhelming because it's so much, and there's so much money and so much history behind it. And we need to start building our canon. So like, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work, is what I have to say about it.
That's a wonderful way to approach this, a very positive, energetic way. And I love that. Because it's so easy to get dejected, looking at what's out there. We're just past the hour, but I have about 4 questions left. So if that's okay, we'll just plod through and get through them. So I have Vasundhara-ji who's asking, is a middle ground between a rights-based perspective and the dharma perspective to life possible in today's America? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as an academic, one of the first things you learn is that that these lenses are not truths. There are ways of looking at things. So what happens when we look at this through this lens? What happens when we look at the same thing through a different lens? And I think, in the conversations I've had in the sort of, I'm not a fan of the term social justice because I think it's very Christian normative. But in the sort of so-called, the very stigmatized liberal academy, I've been able to say that. I've been able to have those conversations. Not necessarily in every space. I have to be very skillful about who I'm talking with. And I've definitely gotten louder about it as I get closer to defending my dissertation and having the letters after my name. But people are open to this. In many cases, it's just simply a lack of awareness about this. And so because we're swimming in Christian normative waters, because we live in Western civilization, people think that this is just what the world is. And one of the affordances of being connected to an ancient Indic civilization is that you have the, I would say, not just the awareness, but you have the language to name it, to say, like, actually, this is just one ocean and there's an entire other ocean. There's an entire way of looking at this. And not simply you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong, but what are the affordances and limitations of looking at the same situation using these different paradigms, and how can everyone benefit from that? I think there's plenty of space to do that. And I don't even think it's about compromising necessarily. I think it's about having some dispassion around it. I think that would really serve us well. A lot of times in these conversations we end up speaking from our conclusions rather than from our assumptions. And one of the things I really love about working in education and working with emergent teachers in these sort of seminar settings as opposed to a lecture setting is that we get to sit and talk about our assumptions as opposed to our conclusions. And from our conclusion, we assume that everyone is operating from the same set of facts and they've just drawn different conclusions, and we're just fighting about conclusions, but we're actually talking about our assumptions.
So I think one thing that perhaps we Hindus don't do enough of, and that would serve as well, is to engage more with non-Hindus. Talking to I don't know how many of us even talk to our neighbors who aren't Hindus, about Hinduism itself. So I think that's really, that's where we can start, by talking to people around us, our colleagues, about Hinduism, where it's appropriate, to bring that into the conversation, rather than, I think we consciously probably shy away from saying anything about it. But perhaps it's time to, and this open vacuum, of authentic information is what allows all the misinformation to come in. So perhaps we should start trying, at least in our little ways, to take back that space, that narrative, and make it our own. I have a question from Shaji, who says, how do students who have not experienced bias against Hinduism identify with such issues?
So I think it's important to separate out, I think personal experiences of bias, obviously they impact us deeply and they're important and we need to address them, especially when they're happening to our children. But I think it's important to, and this is something that's emerged a lot in the past months with this, sort of flashpoint with George Floyd, is there's a distinction between anti-racism work and anti-colonialism work. And anti-Hinduism very much falls under the category of decoloniality or anti-colonial work. So, racism is based on identity. That's how it's constructed, right? And those identities are obviously fluid, but people have determined these are different identities and they've constructed a system of inequity based on identity. And therefore, doing anti-racist work comes back to identity, right? So you give the mic to an African-American person who's a descendant of enslaved people because that's the person who's been impacted by the system. Coloniality and colonialism is an attack not just on people, but on a civilization and the knowledge and the epistemology that undergirds or that informs or creates that. And so I think when a child hasn't personally experienced any kind of bias or even hatred or violence because of their Hindu identity, there's plenty of opportunities to point out the ways in which Hinduism itself is being attacked and what are the implications of that, not just for Hindus, but for the world and for our conceptualizations of what is the right thing and the right way to be in the world. I think, and this is something I bring up in my dissertation work, this is something I bring up in every academic setting I can. I think because the US thinks of itself as the center of the world and in many ways does show up on every shore, whether it's through selling weapons or through Baywatch, we show up everywhere in the world. I think because the notions of anti-oppression tend to be defined by the geographic borders of the United States, and there's a lot more emphasis on anti-colonial work and less on decoloniality in the US. I think there's this tendency to sort of map that onto the rest of the world and the ways in which we're talking about it and to universalize that. And so rather than just saying, that's bad, that's wrong, I'm oppressed by that, all of those things are true, but I think it's powerful to say like, hey, when we focused on white supremacy, we're erasing Western supremacy. And Western supremacy is something that is very much faced by the rest of the world and is not neutral and is not inevitable. And I'm against Western supremacy. And Hinduphobia and anti-Hinduness is a manifestation of Western supremacy. So let's talk about that too.
I have a few parents who are actually, who want to know how they can help. So I have Gayatri ji from Frisco, who is a certified substitute teacher. And she asks, how can she help further the cause of Dharmic values in education? I also have a more generic question from Pushpita ji, who says, how can we help you?
First, everyone be happy. That's the best way to help everything, is to operate from that space of being centered and happy. So that's the first one. And two, don't be afraid, or be okay with your fear and discomfort and continue, come what may. I would love to work more with more educators, be connected with more educators. You know, when I was looking for participants for my dissertation study, it was really hard to find Indian American teachers in New York, even though New York is one of the hubs of the Indian American diaspora. It was actually quite hard. And interestingly, all 4 of my participants were raised in Hindu homes, and 3 of them continue to identify as Hindu American. So it ended up being a study about Hindu American teachers, which is really interesting.
Very interesting.
But I think, you know, in response to the educator question, I think I would love to work with educators. I would love to develop coursework on, and I'm in teacher education specifically, so I would love to develop a course or a series of courses or even a certification on how to teach Hinduism in schools. And I would love to collaborate with other Hindu American teachers on doing that, or other Hindu American teacher educators in doing that. How can everyone help in general? I would say, like, you know, you brought up in the description, in my description, this notion of adhikara. I think it's important when we're talking about all of these different institutions in the United States, everywhere, that are impacting the lived experiences of Hindu Americans. There are those of us who are working in those institutions, and I think supporting our work, not just me, but supporting the work of scholars and practitioners in all of those social institutions. And I use this metaphor all the time, like, just because you were born doesn't mean you know how to deliver a baby. So just because you had an education, that doesn't mean you understand how educational systems work or how to teach, right? And so I think, like, let's chew on this notion of adhikara and how it manifests in contemporary ways in the work we're doing, and where do we want to sort of grow and water those things, nurture those things. Let's continue building community. Let's stop isolating ourselves as a community and really do a lot of rich intergroup work, because I think we have a lot to learn and a lot to share. And stop being in our little isolated bubbles and like, we're super smart about some things as communities, and then as a community, and then other things, I think we have a lot to learn and grow. And I'm so hopeful because, you know, we continue to have conversations like this. It's not very tangible, maybe not very satisfying. Like, I don't have like a GoFundMe that I can send you to. But let's keep talking about these things, and let's stop with the binaries of left and right. Let's stop with any of these. None of these binaries are authentic to our way of envisioning the world. So let's enliven an actual dharmic perspective on the world, because I think these binaries are harming us. They're really harming us. And in the long run, they might be politically savvy, but I think attaching ourselves to them in anything deeper than a sort of skillful political maneuver is a self-goal. So let's like loosen our thinking a little bit. Let's lean into nuance. Let's lean into all of the things that we're given, all the gifts that we're given by our ancestors, and let's enliven that in a contemporary way.
That's an excellent message. Thank you.